Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. Welcome back to Feminine Roadmap Podcast, the podcast that helps you navigate the challenges and the changes of midlife and live a more vibrant second half. If you find us on YouTube, please don't forget to subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss any more conversations. And if you're on a podcast platform, please remember to subscribe, rate, and share this conversation. Today, my guest is going to be talking about her passion for helping women to uncover their inherent power and wisdom during a time of life when we often feel invisible and overlooked, and we doubt ourselves the most. My guest today is Jennifer Arthurton. She's a mentor, podcast host, founder, and creator of Old Chicks Know Shit. Jennifer, thank you so much for being on my show today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
I have to tell the audience that you and I literally just met 2 days ago. It felt like we'd known each other forever. And I'm like, you have to come on my show. And you also have a podcast. So this is a co-promotion of what you do as well, because I really feel like we are on the same path of encouraging women in midlife to live vibrantly and to really trust the wisdom and the power that they have inside of them. But I'd love my audience to hear a little bit about why you were on this path. Why did you found and create this platform and podcast?
So Old Chicks Know Shit was created from my own journey of having to reinvent my life at the age of 50. So in the year leading up to my 50th birthday, I found myself divorced, unemployed, I was an empty nester, and I was also bedridden with a stress-related illness. And I, truly thought that my life was over. I bought into the cultural narrative about 50 is the beginning of the end. I kept saying, who starts over at 50? I would compare myself to everybody, I'm supposed to be riding off into the retirement sunset with a pot of gold under my arm on the arm of a handsome man. And I'm like, none of that is my reality. But I truly didn't believe that it was possible to start over. Like every identity that I had in my life at that particular point, who I thought I was literally stripped away from me. And the scary part for me was I realized that I had no idea who I was. So, I was basically spent probably a little bit longer than I care to admit, lying in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, asking why, what's wrong with me? This is the beginning of the end. Nobody's going to take me seriously. I'm too old. All the things. And then finally at one point, I, got myself together. I put my big girl pants on and I was like, okay, I got a whole chapter ahead of me, right? From 50 to 80, that is 30 years. What am I going to do? Sit around and cry for 30 years and woe is me. And then I got to the point where I was like, okay, where are all the 50 and 60-year-old women who have reinvented themselves? They have to be out there. I need to know what's possible. So I started searching and honestly, I didn't find anything. I literally, the narrative about what it meant to be a 50-year-old woman was all about bladder leakage protection, meal replacement shakes, retirement plans. And I'm like, okay, none of that is my reality. There has to be something else. And so, I began digging and I would find these stories. And then I decided to start the podcast as a way to share the inspiration that I needed with other women who might be in the same boat. Because the one thing I recognized is I felt very alone in it. But as I started sharing my story, I started to realize that there were a lot of women who maybe they weren't quite in the place of crisis that I was, but they wanted something different for their next chapter. Mm-hmm. Right. And I also knew that I'm like, if I want my life to be different, I got to show up differently in it, because what I was doing got me here. I'm not loving it. Right. How do I create the next chapter? But first I had to figure out, okay, what did I even want for my life? Right? I began to see it as an opportunity to be like, okay, I'm going to recreate life on my terms. But what do I want? And that began a huge journey of a spiritual journey and a real big self-development journey, just about understanding myself and what was important to me in my life. And that's kind of what Old Chicks Know Shit is all about now. It's about reminding us that we have so much knowledge, wisdom, experience, our intuition. We've got so much going for us at this time of life, but we don't really see it reflected anywhere, right? And so we doubt ourselves. And my mission is to show women what's possible for the next chapter of their lives.
Oh my gosh. Preach to the choir, girl. Just preach to the choir. This is what I have been, that's the drum I've been banging for 5 years.
Yeah.
And I had the same experience, right? You and I talked about this when we talked the other day. It's like looking for that other kindred spirit out there, like these other women, and they thought they have to be there. But we had to create a beacon to draw them to ourselves, because honestly, the messaging is still kind of archaic. You know, I've talked to several women who talk about that invisibility factor and that imposter syndrome, that really that dichotomy of, man, look at all these things I've done in my life. Then you get here and somehow we're supposed to negate all of that and disappear. And, you know, maybe not everyone feels that way, but there's definitely a message. You know, there's this whole other thing happening where it's like, oh, you need to look 20, you need to be hot, you need to be sexy, you need to be this, you need to be that. And so we're still being kind of pressed into a mold of looking a certain way. So that's not freedom either.
No, I mean, you know, it's really refreshing to see older women hitting the mainstream narrative in terms of like being reflected in advertising and things like that. But I will qualify that with saying most of the women who are, you know, like you think of Mae Musk, right? Like most of the women are genetically gifted. You know, they still kind of fit the ideal of beauty. Like they're tall, they're thin, you know, they have the right chiseled face. They don't have, you know, too many wrinkles. Like they definitely have the gray hair. But we still hold that up as the ideal for women. And, you know, for most of us, that's not our reality. We're not tall, lanky, thin with perfect cheekbones, right? We're just not. And so we're still comparing ourselves. So even though the mainstream narrative has maybe moved from, you know, models always being 30 and, you know, that being the reflection of beauty, now we have a beauty ideal of what it means to be a 50 or a 60-year-old woman. And it's still not reality because most of us can't relate to it. Right. And so it's like we're always trying to catch up to fit into that mold of what, you know, beautiful is. And I saw a study a little while ago that says like we take in something like 3,000 images every week of what it means to fit the beauty ideal, right? So even if we're not consciously thinking, oh, I don't have high cheekbones and long legs, subconsciously, all of that stuff is seeping into our brains, and we're somehow trying to measure ourselves up against that ideal. So even though the ideal might be shifting, you know, it's still trying to put us in a box of what we're supposed to look like, as opposed to being, you know, my whole thing is this time of our lives is not about the outside of us at all. It's about what's inside us, like who we are as people. And this is where I have what I call the midlife paradox, right? We're stronger, smarter, better than we've ever been. We have more knowledge, wisdom, and experience. We're more confident, but yet we doubt ourselves more than we ever have in our entire life. And that's the reason, is because, right, we're trying to measure up to some societal ideal of what it's supposed to be, what we're supposed to be. Right. So it's a tricky situation to navigate. And also because as women, we are taught to see our value in the things that we do outside of us, right? Like, am I a good mom? Am I a good wife? Am I a good sister? You know, is my body physically pleasing? Right. And so, you know, we're always measuring outside of us. We've never been taught about the inside, like what's important inside of us. Right. So, yeah. Oh, I'm on my soapbox. I could continue.
I'm like, move over. I need to stand up here with you.
I know.
But you know what? It's something we know, right? We understand that we've lived our lives trying to measure up to something, or measure ourselves against something. Let's not even use the word up, because it's not up from us.
No, exactly.
It's next to us. It's an ideal that continues to be peddled to us, that takes away our sense of self-worth and value. And I agree with you that this is an inside game, but the secret is it's always been an inside game.
Yeah.
And we now know better, and we need to do better.
Yeah, exactly. But I think, you know, because we've been taught as women to, you know, to see our value outside of us, like when, you know, our looks are changing. Maybe we don't look like we used to. We've got a few more wrinkles, more gray hair. Maybe we've added a few pounds, right? Our kids are leaving home. Maybe our careers are on autopilot, right? And so all of those places where we found that validation, it's changing. And
Yes.
so then we start going, okay, so where do I fit in? If I'm not really a mother, if I'm not a career woman, if I'm not a wife, if I'm not whatever these things are, like, where do I fit? And that becomes the struggle, right? Like, that was definitely my struggle, right? All my identities, corporate executive, wife, mother. Even at the time, I was like a really big gym goer. I mean, couldn't get out of bed, so definitely couldn't go to the gym, although I tried. Like, all of that was stripped away from me, and I didn't know who the person was underneath all of that.
Mm.
And I think so many of us have, grown up and identifying ourselves by the roles we play as opposed to who we are.
Yeah. Which makes sense. I mean, it's a
Yeah.
logical thing to do, but I would love to hear more about how did you start to literally get out of bed and go through your reinvention? Because I'm always fascinated by the way that different women come at this reinvention. So let's talk a little bit about your journey.
Yeah. So, it was very interesting because I realized at one point that everything that had kind of happened to me and brought me to this place, like, I was literally forced into a place of stillness, right?
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't go anywhere or do anything. I didn't have a job to go to. My kid was gone. I didn't have anybody to look after, and I couldn't get out of bed. And so I was literally kind of forced into this place of stillness. And at first I resisted it hard, like really, really hard, because I was busy. Do, go, 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 go. So for me to be still was so uncomfortable, like so uncomfortable. And then I realized after a little while that in the stillness, it actually gave me a bit of space. Like, it's almost like my life had created space for me to say, hey, who are you and what do you want? And I would lie there in my bed going, like, who am I? Like, who is Jennifer? Like, what is it that she wants? And I began thinking, so I began journaling at that point, right? I would just write. Sometimes it would be like random gibberish, but it would be like, what comes up today? What's making me happy? Okay. So I would go for these, 10-minute walks in nature. And, like, it was all I could do because I just literally didn't have the energy. I was so burnt out. So sometimes I would walk into the forest and I would sit down against a tree and I would just be like, okay, what thoughts are coming up for me right now? Like, what's popping up? What's making me happy? Right. And it would be literally moment by moment by moment. I would be like, okay, this feels really good to me. I'm going to do this. And I literally did this thing, like getting to know myself by following what made me happy, like following my bliss. Right. I started at that point writing. Like one day I had just had the inspiration while I was sitting in the forest. Okay, just write. And I was like, okay, I had never really written anything other than, like, a corporate email or a strategy deck. Was never a writer. I didn't call myself a writer, but I started writing, and then I felt called to share my writing, and so I started a blog, right? And it was just like that's where I started to realize that there were women who were just like me, who were struggling with this. Who am I? Like, what do I want from my life question? Mm-hmm. And I remember the first time I ever hit publish on my blog and put my thoughts out into the on the internet, it took every ounce of strength I had to not go back and delete it for like 3 or 4 days, because I was like, what the hell am I doing? Like, I'm putting my but I was literally just following these like nudges. So I just decided to follow my bliss, like follow whatever was making me happy in that moment. And I realized as I was doing this, following my bliss, like I was recognizing these little inner nudges, these little, ideas that would come to me, and I would just follow them and see what happens, right? Because at that point I had nothing to lose, right? So I was literally just following like whatever came up, and I tried all kinds of things, right? Like the podcast was one idea that came up, and I mean that I had no idea I was going to love podcasting as much as I love podcasting, but it was just these things, and I started to realize that I had this guidance system that was inside me as opposed to where I had always had my focus, which was outside of me, like my job, my family, all of those types of things. And I started to really, really hone in on those, that part of me, right? Like to build a relationship with that inner part, like my intuition, basically.
Yeah.
Was what it was. And I'm talking about it now like it's all like a number of simple steps. It was a process, right, of kind of getting to know myself, but I had to spend the time to be able to do it. And that's where I realized that everything that had happened in my life had created a little pocket of time that would allow me to be able to figure out me, like created space. And then it was from there, it was just like, okay, every day I made a point of having a morning practice where every day I would journal, every day I would meditate and ask myself like, like what should I do today? Like, what's my next step? I would just be constantly asking for guidance from inside myself, from the universe, from whatever, and following that, because I recognized that in my entire life I had done everything that I was supposed to do, like, go to school, get a good job, work my way up the ranks, do all the things. And all the way along there, you'd have these little like, is this it? Is this really what I'm supposed to be doing? Like, I was constantly questioning, but when the question came up, I would push it aside because I didn't know there was any other option. Right. And so, being able to have this space now where I'm like, oh, I can now rebuild something that is coming from inside me, as opposed to following the things that I thought I should be doing as to how I would live my life. And that was probably the biggest change that I made, was going inside and, finding the woman who turns out to be kind of a cool chick, actually. But I like her. But literally it was that understanding myself and what was important to me, like what was meaningful for me, and then following the nudges that were built around that, right? And also shifting the perspective from everything that I was losing to what it was I wanted and possibility. Right? Like that perspective shift was huge too, because I sat in the woe is me, look at everything I've lost bucket for a long time, and it doesn't feel good. It just doesn't. Right? On the flip side, it was like, well, what could this be? Right? And stepping into possibility just feels so much better. Yeah. So it was a big like spiritual and personal development journey that, took some time.
I hear what I hear you saying is, when you're in that pity pot, or you're, and it's a real thing. Loss and grieving and all of that is something to be honored and made space for. But if we get stuck, we don't see possibility. Like, it's literal brain science, right? If you focus on the negative, your brain's like, got it, all things negative, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So you have to open a window somewhere of possibility, is what I hear you saying, so that your brain kind of goes, oh,
there's another option.
There's another option. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I do now, and that I, teach my clients and students, is about the power of visualization. So this has been a huge thing for me in my life. And I didn't realize I've always done it, but I wasn't really aware of what I was doing until I really got to this place where creating a vision of what you want, right? And really getting into that vision, like feeling the emotions, feeling the feelings of it, is creating like a stamp on your subconscious mind. It's like programming something in there so that you can start to begin to work towards it. Because what most of us do, we put all of our focus and attention on what could go wrong, without really realizing that we're programming that into our subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind, like you said, is going, oh, okay, I got my orders. This is where we're going.
Yes.
Right? And because there's no other option, there's no contrast, there's no comparison, right? Because we've never created the vision on the other side. That's where we end up, right? So it's a little bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So creating the vision of what it is that you want for your life is so critically important. And, the vision doesn't land on you in like a complete movie. It comes in periods and pieces and chunks, as you move through this, right? Like little pieces would land and I'd be like, oh, okay, that sounds really cool. I could totally imagine myself doing that, and I could visualize it. And then another chunk would land and I'd be like, oh, it's going to go this way, right? And that's what happened. I'm still doing that today because life is not static. Right? It's constantly moving. Energy is not static. It's constantly moving. And our job is to just flow with it. Right? So creating that visualization was an incredibly important part. It still is to this day of my own journey, and, focusing on what I want and how I create that thing. Right?
Now, one of the things that I've heard, and I think you'll probably understand what I'm saying, is we often get hung up on how am I going to do that? But it doesn't start with the how, it starts with the what.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What do I want to do? And it's like you said, there's almost like crumbs along the way, or like someone else said on one of my podcasts, it's a thread that you pull, kind of pull all the little threads that come up and see where they take you.
Well, yeah, because our brain, as soon as, we have a vision for something, our brain wants to go, well, how is that possible? How is it? And this is the part where we need to like let go and trust, right? Because we don't have all of the pieces of information, right? Like our conscious mind doesn't have, the who, the how, the first, like here's the 10 step to your vision, right? We don't have all of that. But if we can just like focus on the possibility and just let go and allow it to, to guide us there, then yeah, that's how it works. But when we try and control it, when we're like in the resistance of controlling and trying to force it, and it ends up working against us.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting conversation, isn't it? There's two things that popped into my mind as you were sharing. The control and the resistance is one, and the other is the how, because when we look back, it's easy to see how we did what we did sometimes. And we forget that at the time, we didn't have that information.
Right.
We forget that information was attained as along the journey, just like it is now. And as far as that resistance, it is, that's our brain trying to protect us. But the reality is that our resistance is twofold. It is protection, but it's also in a lot of ways, maybe pointing us toward the possibility. Do you know what I mean? Like there are things we resist that really are the thing we're supposed to be open
100%,
to.
100%. I mean, so many times along my journey, I got stuck, in the pit of resistance. I remember kind of early on in my journey, and I actually, at this point, I was still working and being like really called to go to a meditation class that was at my local yoga studio. Okay. I had tried to meditate many, many times before. I had decided that it wasn't for me because my brain was too busy, right? Because I'd be making mental to-do lists and shavasana and things like that. And I remember I was on a business trip in New York, and I took a standby flight home to make sure that I could make the meditation class. And we're sitting in this room, dimly lit yoga studio, those 5 of us sitting on mats. And we, the instructor is taking us through this guided meditation. And I started to feel this like well of emotion coming up.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, what's happening? What's happening? What's going on? Right. I'm like, get your shit together, Jennifer. Like, what's going on? Right. And I'm trying to control this thing. I'm like literally trying to like just keep the lid on. Like you just have to do this for half an hour more, keep the lid on. I can't control it. It literally just bubbles up, and I'm sitting there like sobbing. I'm not just like tear running down my face. I'm sobbing. And the teacher just pushes a box of Kleenex over onto my mat. She doesn't say anything. And I sit there like basically trying not to disturb the rest of the class with my nose blowing. Right. And I leave there, and I have like, oh, what a sight. 2 mitts full of snotty Kleenex, mascara running down my face, right? And as I'm leaving, the teacher, she still doesn't really say anything to me about it. She just smiles and nods at me. And at the end, she says, oh, I've got an 8-week session coming up if you'd like to join. And before I even knew what I was doing, I was like, okay, I signed up. Every week for 8 weeks, I would get on that mat and I would start to cry. I still had no idea why I was crying, right? And every week I fought it. I was just like, okay, this is not happening. This is not happening. Somewhere around like week 4, I was like, clearly I have no control over what's happening here. I am just going to let it take over, do whatever it needs to do, right? I might not survive it, but like whatever, I can't control it. And again, I probably up until class maybe 6 or 7 was still crying on my mat every time. But what that did was, what I didn't realize, and you alluded to this earlier, was there was so much grief about everything that I had lost, right? Not just that, but like all the other emotions that I had stuffed down for years and years and years along the way was like all packed in there. And when I finally created this tiny little bit of space, it all came to the surface. And that thing that I had been resisting for so long, like all of those emotions that I had been resisting for so long, when they came up and out, I literally felt like somebody had taken a 50-pound weight on me. I still didn't really, at that time, and looking back on it, I can see it as grief. I still didn't really know what it was. But I was like, that was the beginning of when I realized, okay, I just need to surrender to everything that's happening. Right? I mean, again, it was a bit of a process, but it was like the beginning of the journey where I'm like, okay, surrender to what your life is showing you here, because there's a lesson here. There's lessons here for you. And along the way, that's the other part that I did, is like whatever was in front of me, I surrendered to it. And I said, okay, what am I supposed to know? Like, what am I supposed to learn? What is this supposed to be showing me? Right. And that was part of like the unfolding, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because your journey needs to be your journey. And the longer you resist, the longer you resist, the longer it takes you. But you are going to get there eventually, right? Like it kind of forced me, like my life forced me into that place. But had I listened to the, is this it? And if I had, maybe not stuffed so much emotion, right? I probably wouldn't have had to get to the place of crisis in order to figure out there was something missing in my life.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever, it happened the way that it happened, and I'm thankful for the gifts that it gave me. But it doesn't need to be that way. If we can just start honoring what's inside of us and stop resisting the thing, right? Like, or we have an idea of something that we want to do, and then we're like, oh, I'm too old, I can't do this because I don't have the how and I don't know the who and the and then we stuff it down and we keep going, right? It doesn't go away. We're just stuffing it in. So just being open and trusting yourself, that's the other big part, right? Like trusting yourself to surrender to the journey, trusting yourself to handle what's going to come up was a huge part of it. Because again, as women, we're not taught to trust ourselves.
There's so much truth around the fact that we often know somewhere inside of us, there's a knowing about things. So you can call it intuition, listening to your gut. You can call it the subconscious mind and life experience. Your subconscious has been tracking every single thing in your entire life and building a dossier, right? So I think that precious piece that you're sharing is we need to partner with ourselves and that inner knowing and that inkling, that thing that says, hey, what about this? Hey, what about that? And holding a space for ourselves like we might for a friend. There's that,
yes,
this precious process, I suppose, of holding a space for ourselves and our possibility instead of judging it out the gate, right? Saying, what if? What if?
Yeah. What if? Powerful, two very powerful words. Yeah, that lead to possibility, right?
Yeah, because it is a bit scary, isn't it? Like my journey since I left, retail cosmetics, and I've taken several journeys, which I've shared on my podcast before, and a break to be a caregiver. And now I'm back where I feel like I was, 5-6 years ago. And I'm like, did I not go anywhere in 6 years? But then it's like, okay, what are the gifts that today are offering me? What did I gain from that? And maybe that disruption, that interruption, and maybe you can share this in your life, was as grief-filled as it was, and as truly a loss as it really was. You mentioned there's always beauty from ashes, I believe. There's always gifts in the storms. It doesn't mean that the storm was the gift per se, right? But if we look for it, I've used the analogy in the past of slivers of light, right? There's slivers of light in the darkness always. It might be the merest sliver, but when we make room for that sliver of light, which is basically what you did when you cried for 7 weeks.
Yeah, that's in fact, that's exactly it, because I couldn't have created the vision of the life that I wanted with all of that stuffed in. They're literally just physically and mentally and emotionally, there wasn't space, right? So I had to like do some housekeeping, get rid of all of that old crap. It was like cleaning out a room, right? Like I had to get rid of all of that old crap so that I could make space for what needed to come in. I didn't recognize that was what was happening at the time, but now, like you said, hindsight being 2020, I can absolutely see that I had to let go of some stuff to allow new stuff to come in, right? And I think those slivers of light, as you so beautifully described it, like by being able to see the light coming through the crack enough to be able to say, okay, I'm going to go there.
Yeah.
Right. Even if it's the tiniest little sliver, I'm just going to go there. Right. And opening the door to possibility, right? Like asking, like those two words that you just used, what if, right? Like those two words are more powerful than probably anything that we could do, because when we get to the what if stage, we're again, opening the crack to that little sliver of light that there's something on the other side of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, often when women come to me, it's, or they join the community, it's, I know I want something more for my next chapter. I want something different, but I have no idea what it is or how to get there. And I tell everybody, you do know. The answer is inside of you, right? Our job at this time of our life is to refocus from outside of ourselves to inside of ourselves, because inside we have all the answers. And then when you start having the conversation, you hear these like, I would love to have been able to do this. Right. And I'm like, oh, look, you just said something like, what if that was possible? Right. And then, it's like, oh, really? Could it be? Right. And as soon as you open the door to that question, you start asking more questions, better questions. Maybe you even take an action step in that direction. But it's opening the door and following that little sliver of light, that can create incredibly magical things in your life. Like I could not have, if you had told me 10 years ago that I would be living the life that I am today, I'd have been like, yeah, no, that's not possible for me. Right. Because I didn't have a vision. It wasn't even a possibility.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, asking yourself what if just for a few minutes every day is just a powerful way even to start that journey.
That's really a great thought. Just have like a dream practice, right? Like it, you hear it all the time. If money wasn't an object, if time wasn't an object, but really, why not ask those questions? It doesn't hurt anything to dream beyond what you think is possible, because we do have to stretch, if you will, our perceptions of things, because we have lived to this point under a certain, belief system, a certain perception of the world and ourselves and where we fit in it. And someone told me about a book by an author named Joyce Major, and it's called Smiling at the World. I'm in the middle of reading it now. And she took an entire year. She was a real estate agent and a single mom, and she took an entire year to travel the world and do volunteer work in 11 different countries. And, her journey and the process of the emotional side of it is so appropriate to what you're sharing with me, Jennifer, because it's like, it didn't seem possible, but she was in nature. This is so great. It's like there's this thread from what you're sharing to what she was sharing, and trying to figure out as an empty nester, like, is this it? Is this what I want to do with the rest of my life? No one's at home. It's just me, and this is fine. And there it is, right? This is fine. I'm okay. Things are good, right? We use these terms, but what if you want to travel? What if you want to learn to underwater basket weave, or what, like what if it sounds crazy to somebody else? That's not the right what if question, right? It's this possibility.
Yeah.
That we could do something that we've dreamt of, haven't even thought of yet. Right. And it's interesting that your journey started with that quietude.
Yeah.
And nature. It's fascinating because that was exactly where her journey started as well. And so I wanted to bring that to the forefront, because we are such busy people just in general. And then as women, we're anchoring people, we're helping people, we're serving people. And those are all beautiful things. But this season of life is often a time to shift. At least that's how I see it.
Well, I think the problem is that, why we feel stuck when we get to this season of life is because, we've been so busy doing that, and we're last on our to-do list. We've become completely disconnected from ourselves.
Yeah.
Right. And the whole job that we need to do now is to tune back in and do that and reconnect. And there are 3 words that I use all the time that are so powerful in terms of that connection: is silence, stillness, and solitude. Maybe all 3, maybe one of them, maybe a combination of 2 of them. But if you can get to that place where you can create like moments of silence for yourself, like
Mm-hmm.
you get up in the morning before your rest of your house is up and you have your coffee in complete silence, no TV, no book, no phone, no nothing, just sit there. Right? Like what thoughts come up? What am I feeling right now? Like, what do I need today? Maybe you could ask yourself questions, right? Or, going into nature, like you were just talking about, so powerful because it's just a way, again, it's, silence, stillness, solitude, like nature is that in itself, right? If you're standing in the middle of the forest, there is no sound, right? And also because nature is so grounding,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like our energies are scattered all over the place from all of our to-do lists and our duties and our obligations, right? Coming back into nature, like me sitting at the foot of a tree, I recognize exactly what that is now. That was me like grounding back, like just bringing my energy down so that I could create little bits of space.
Yeah.
Right. So, if you feel called to go to nature, just do it. Like you don't have to do anything fancy there. Like go sit under a tree, right? If that's what it takes.
Mm-hmm.
But you're being called to something, right? Like, so again, it was those inner nudges for me that like I didn't understand them, but I was like, okay, go to the forest. Okay, I'm going to the forest, right? I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, I get this now. I mean, now being in nature is part of a daily practice for me, right? I go into nature every day because I know like that's where I ground in, that's where I have my best thoughts, that's where I can hear my intuition talking
Mm-hmm.
to me,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And
Like sometimes
listening.
listening. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one of my favorite things to do in the summertime is to hop on my paddleboard and go out into the middle of the lake. And I'm sitting out there surrounded by water, no phone, no nothing, right? Complete solitude, complete silence. And I can hear myself. I can hear my inner voice. I know what she's asking of me.
As you're
Right?
saying that, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
It's going to be, I'm requiring brutal honesty. Was there a time that you didn't like what you heard in the silence?
All absolutely. There are times where um, any personal or spiritual development journey requires you to look at yourself very,
Mm-hmm.
very closely with a microscope. And sometimes that can be really, really uncomfortable. You have to admit things about yourself that maybe you don't want to admit, maybe you don't want to see. But if they're coming up, they're coming up for a reason because there's something on the other side of that. Right. So, how I'm showing up in a relationship, for example, like maybe I'm, not doing what I said I was going to be doing. Maybe I'm not taking the action that I need to be taking. Right. Sometimes that can be very confronting. Right. But instead of
Mm-hmm.
like beating myself up about it, it's like, oh, curious. Like, why is this being shown to me? Right. And even if you're asking that question, why is this being shown to me? Right.
Mm-hmm.
There's always an answer to that. Something that
Mm-hmm.
you need to hear. And it's part of the journey. It's part of like I truly believe like our souls know what we want. Our soul comes to this planet with a purpose.
Yes.
Right. And we're
Yes.
being led all the way. And again, if we can listen to that inner voice, like
Mm-hmm.
tune out the noise, listen to that inner voice, we're going to be guided to that purpose. And so when we talk about like finding the meaning and purpose at this time of our lives, that's inside of us. Only we know that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And we can't get there if we're not listening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. There's been many, many times I've resisted. Huge. I mean, at one point in my journey, I was like, okay, I can't do this. This is too much. I'm going to go back to the safety of what I know. And I went back to the corporate world and I took a job, which on paper was a fantastic job. And like probably 6, 8 weeks into it, I was like, oh my goodness, I just made the biggest mistake. Like, this is not what I want. Like, I knew going in that I probably wasn't making the right decision, but on paper, it was the perfect decision. But as soon
Mm-hmm.
as I got into the job, I was like, oh, yeah, no, this just does not feel right. And I had to like really, confront my intuition about like, okay, why did you send me here? And I was like, oh, my intuition didn't send me here. My brain sent me here. Right? My intuition was like, okay, keep going, keep going. My brain was like, no, 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 we need, right?
Yeah.
And I ended up having to quit after like 4 or 5 months because I was like, no, this is not what I wanted. And I knew that like physically I could feel it in my body. And then I had to be like, okay, we're going back to that path because that's as uncomfortable as it was. I knew it was right. Like I knew it was the right thing. And had I stayed in that job, I wouldn't be where I am now. So
There's this weird dichotomy of uncomfortableness and peace at the same time.
oh, yeah. Yes.
It's so
Absolutely.
weird, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. You can be uncomfortable and know it's the right thing. Like
Yeah.
it's a very different feeling. And again, you have to be kind of tuned in to be able
Yeah.
to recognize the difference in that feeling, right?
Yeah. Cause I'm in that place now. I'll be like, okay, I'm just gonna, maybe I'll get a part-time job. Maybe I'll do this. And every time it's like,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, but it would solve some things, right? But then
Right.
I know so deeply that is not what I need to do. But then I don't know exactly what it is yet. I mean, this podcast is clear. Okay, that's the one thing. I'm like, this I know. Okay, cool. But I just have that sense of more. And I wonder if you've had the same journey where you question your greatness or you question your sense of there's more for you to accomplish, because I think that's where the imposter syndrome comes in. Like, who am I to think that I have something so amazing to offer to the world? That's got to be a universal thought.
Oh, 100%. Like I mean, I question it all the time, you know. First of all, I think imposter syndrome is normal. It's just a mechanism in our brain. It doesn't mean really anything. It's just our brain trying to keep us in our comfort zone, right? And I think, this is where we talk about trusting the unfolding of things, right? And I'm at a place now where I'm like, okay, this is still unfolding, right? Maybe it will be unfolding forever. I don't know. I'm not in the future yet, right? But I do what feels right now. And then, if it's supposed to be something else, that something else will be revealed to me. And I know that, like, I trust that, right? So I'm like, okay, today this feels really good. Somewhere down the road, there might be some other inkling that says, okay, now you need to go in this direction. But I also trust that where I am now is also serving a purpose. There's something that I need out of this particular time that is going to serve me moving forward. Right. And this is the allowing and trusting, as opposed to, okay, I'm going to be a podcaster and I'm going to force it to work, because maybe it wouldn't. Maybe you're being forced down this road because you're meant to meet a person who's going to take you in a completely different direction that you couldn't possibly imagine right now. We don't know that, right? But we do have to trust what's unfolding. I mean, so many times on my journey, I said, okay, that's it. I quit. I can't do this because it's hard. And then I'm like, a day later, I'm like, okay, well, you can't quit. You literally, I just can't. Like, it's not even an option. It makes me feel better for a few minutes to say, I quit. But then I know, like you said, you have that knowing where you're like, no, that's not even an option for you. You have to keep going. So then you're like, okay, here we go. I'm going forward again. Right.
Yeah.
But I think we have to trust that unfolding, because we don't know. And we have to trust that, we're being guided to our purpose. Right. Like, and that we have, and this is the other part. If we have a dream or a desire on our heart, we have everything we need to bring that desire to reality. I truly, like, 100% with my whole heart, because if we didn't have what it took, we wouldn't have that particular dream or that particular desire. Right. So while it might feel out of reach and we doubt ourselves and we doubt the possibility of it, we have to trust that our dreams and desires are not random. They are given to us for a reason. It's part of the journey that we need to go on. Right. So we have to trust that this is given to us for a reason, and that we have exactly what it takes to bring that thing to reality. Like, again, with my whole heart, I believe that, and I believe that to be true of absolutely everybody. Like, we have gifts, and our gifts are being used in ways that we can't even imagine.
Yeah. And it's faith in those realities.
Yeah.
Not everything is, quote, quantifiable in a way where it can be measured and weighed. And, there's a faith journey in this reinvention. Some people use the word rebirth. I think that's a lovely way of describing what we're going through. And it's not like what you've done wasn't good, or that part of you wasn't good, but that was a season, right? And now it's this season. And I think that shedding that you experienced is actually such an important part of the process.
Yeah. Yeah.
To clear the path in our hearts and in our minds and in our souls so that we can move forward. And I think a lot of people are afraid of that journey, but the freedom that's on the other side of a journey like that, the shedding of the grief, the shedding of the disappointment, the shedding of whatever it is, unmet expectations or dreams that we thought were shattered, because some dreams resurface, some are reshaped, right? Some were just for a season of our lives. I mean, I really feel like this journey that you're talking about, this intuitive journey, that's why it's so important, because it is true.
Yeah.
No one can tell us what our gut, if you will, is telling us, what it's, and it may make sense to no one outside of us too. So there's courage, that curiosity, the courage, the faith. These are the words that come up as I listen to your story and think about what it takes for someone to take this journey. I feel like safety is rarely the central word in the process.
Yeah, you kind of have to step off safety, and for sure. But here's the other thing, and I've seen this with myself, and I see it with my clients, and I hear it in the stories that I share on the podcast. All of the experiences that we have along the way may seem random and disconnected, but they're actually aligning to something. And we come to this place where all of these pieces, all of these supposedly random experiences, like fit together. And it's like, oh, I get it now. This all makes sense. This is exactly what I was supposed to be doing. And I couldn't be doing that if I hadn't had this experience over here. I mean, I literally had an epiphany last week about my own business and about, all of the parts of my life that have, my career experience, my lived experience, like all of this stuff where I saw it all of a sudden coming together. And as it came together, I'm like, oh, it's actually shifting the direction of my business a bit. Not a bit, actually. It's really shifting the business direction of my business. So I had like some of the pieces and I was marching forward with that. And then these other things, I'm like, oh, these two pieces hanging out here, glom, glom, this is where they fit on. And as it turns out, and again, I see this happening all the time, it's so beautifully aligned with who I am authentically as a person. Like it's all the things that I love. It's all of the things that are just inherent to who I am, as a person in the life that I've lived. And when you see all those pieces come together, you're like, oh, it feels so easy. It feels so effortless because it is you. It is a reflection of you. Right. And I truly believe our soul's purpose is about collecting all of those gifts that we have and using them for something. Right. So the ugly parts, the parts that we want to erase, the beautiful parts, the hard experiences, like all of that comes together in a way that makes so much sense. And that's where we find our gifts. Like in fact, I have so many of my clients go through this exercise of like, what's all the experience that you've had, right? Okay, make a bucket of that. What are the things that you just inherently love to do? Okay, and somewhere in that, there's the thread of things that are leading you to that purpose.
Yeah. Right? You know what it reminds me of is a symphony, right? When somebody writes a symphony, they write a different part for every instrument. And alone, outside of the melody alone, it makes no sense. If that timpani is doing just what the timpani does, but without the rest of the instruments, you can't get the message, right? Yeah. But you're kind of like, well, I mean, it's cool, but I don't get it, So when they bring all of the instruments together, and they finally get to play together, and they finally find their rhythm together, then it's like, I see it now. Yeah. And that's our life in a nutshell.
Beautiful analogy. I love it.
So now I would love to have you share, Jennifer, kind of 3 anchor points. What are 3, things that you really want women to hear from your heart?
first of all, I want women to know that this is actually, midlife is actually the most powerful point in your life for creation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like you have everything you need in this particular moment to create whatever it is that you want in your life, right? Like it's no longer about, building the family or, taking care of the family and the career. This is like all about us and what's inside of us, right? And it's the most powerful point in our lives for creation. So I want to know that, because the cultural narrative is not that. Second, all of us, every single one of us has gifts.
Mm-hmm.
And this time of our life is all about sharing those gifts, right? There's a thing in Chinese medicine where, and I am not a Chinese medicine expert by any means, let me qualify, the qi meridian, which goes through the body, which is your life force energy that goes through the body. When we're in our reproductive years, the qi flows downwards towards our reproductive organs. Yeah. It makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
When we hit menopause, that chi energy actually reverses and comes up and out through the eyes so that a woman can share her gifts with the world.
Mm-hmm.
So like this is like our body knows this, right? Like our energy knows this. And it's just about now getting our brain to align with that fact and to see the possibility that exists in this chapter of our lives. It's the longest chapter of our life yet. Between like 50 and 80 is 30 years, the longest chapter yet. We might even have 2 or 3 chapters in there. And we can choose. We get to choose. We get to choose again, like what we want this next chapter to be.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I love that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we are so much more powerful than we give ourselves credit for. So much more powerful, and we have everything that we need inside of us.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It's incredible the way that we're designed and the flow of life.
Yeah.
And if we're willing to lean in and trust, it's incredible.
Yeah.
So, Jennifer, how can people find you? Tell us where you can be found and listened to in the world.
Yes. So you can find me by my handle, Old Chicks Know Shit. So that's KNOW shit.com. So that's my website, oldchicksknowshit.com. I'm also on Instagram by the same name, on Facebook by the same name, and I also have a free Facebook group. And then you can also find the Old Chicks Know Shit podcast, where I share real stories of real women who are reinventing themselves, tackling challenges, chasing their dreams. And basically it's sharing the inspiration that we all need to be able to, create the life that we love for this next chapter.
Fantastic. Well, Jennifer, of course, I am so grateful that I had the opportunity to meet you, that you and I had our little exploratory phone call where we found out we are kindred spirits. And I love it's a crazy connection that we have. And it's because you are a woman who is living your life from your heart. You're sharing your message from your heart. You've chosen to do the courageous thing, to do the work, allow the journey, and then share it with the world. It's such an incredible gift that you're giving to people, because we need women who are willing to allow the truth of their difficult journey to come to. It's like planting that garden. You've done a wonderful job of tilling the soil, planting the seeds, and then allowing the world to see the fruit of that labor. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I loved our conversation.
Yeah. And we're not done. Isn't that one of those, every time I'm like, gosh, we could have talked for another hour.
We'll do a part 2 one day for sure.
We totally should. So today, friends, I want to thank you for being with us. And remember, if you are on YouTube, all you have to do is look down below in the description box. I'm going to have those links to Jennifer there. And also, if you're on the podcast platform and you happen to be driving, just head on over to www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 311. And all of the links will be there to Jennifer. Jennifer Arthurton, just to remind you, is the founder and creator of Old Chicks Know Shit. Go check her out. This conversation today is one of those ones that is just divinely appointed. I don't know how else to put it. When Jennifer reached out to me and we set up a chat just the other day, it was like it was like it was just meant to be. And so if you're listening to this podcast, in my mind, that's your connection to this. This is meant to be. There's something in this for you. And that's why you stayed. So hold that space for yourself. Open up, follow that sliver of light. Give yourself the chance to expand your perception of yourself and who you can be in this world. Not that you haven't been enough to this point, but there is more. Hold that space for yourself, my friends. Figure out what that looks like. Pull on the thread, follow the crumbs, whatever analogy works for you, and give yourself the opportunity to blossom and grow into this greater version of yourself in this second half of life. And enjoy the journey, my friends. I want to thank you again for being with us. I look forward to sharing more inspirational people's tips, strategies in the weeks to come. Take care, my friends. Bye-bye.